At a private family dinner, my daughter's father-in-law shoved a contract toward me demanding I hand my watch shop over to his son so they could turn it into a nightclub. When I refused, he sneered. "A broke old man like you has no right to say no." Then he threw hot coffee across my chest. My daughter only lowered her head in silence. I was about to stand up and leave when a woman entered, stared at him and asked coldly, "Do you understand what you just did to him?" The entire room went silent. If you found Dad Family Revenge today, I'm genuinely grateful you stayed. Tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from right now? Your answer means more than you know. Before we continue, some details in this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes. Names and settings are not drawn from any specific person or place, but the lesson at the heart of that part, is entirely real. The first customer of the day walked in at 8:17 on a Friday morning in July, carrying a small cardboard box, the way people carry things they are not sure still have value. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, wearing a gray linen jacket that had been ironed recently, but not carefully. He set the box on the glass counter and cleared his throat. My uncle found this in my grandfather's closet," he said. "Nobody in the family knows if it still runs. My grandfather passed in 2009. I lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a square of old flannel, was a pocket watch. Gold case dented on the lower left side, the way metal dents when it falls from a height onto concrete. I turned it over. The engraving on the back read, "For Arthur. Time well spent." I pressed the crown gently and held the watch near my ear. Nothing. Not even the faintest tick. "How long has it been quiet?" I asked. The man shrugged, and his shoulders dropped the way shoulders do when someone is carrying more than just a question about a watch. "At least 15 years. Maybe longer." I set the watch under the examination lamp, reached for my loop, and took a closer look at the movement through the crystal. The balance wheel had stopped mid-swing, frozen at an angle that told me the mainspring had either broken or seized completely. "Leave it with me," I said. "I'll call you by Wednesday." He looked around the shop the way first-time visitors always do, slowly, like they are trying to figure out what kind of place this is. 3 glass display cases along the left wall, each one holding clocks and watches at various stages of repair. A long work table in the back with a magnifying lamp, a tray of sorted spare parts, and the particular smell of watchmaker's oil that I had stopped noticing somewhere around 1994. Shelves on the right stacked with repair folders, reference catalogs, and 3 wall clocks waiting to be picked up by owners who kept forgetting to come back. The front window still carried the original hand-painted lettering from the year I opened Whitmore Clock and Watch Repair Est, 1989. The man thanked me and left. "My name is Nathan Whitmore. I am 60 years old, and I have worked in this shop on the corner of Spring Street and Worcester in Soho, Manhattan, for 35 years. I own the building. I own the lot behind it. I hold 17 active patents in mechanical watchmaking, and through a company called Whitmore Horology, I receive licensing income from partners in Switzerland, Japan, and Germany. I am telling you this now because there will be people in this story who assumed I was none of those things, and the assumption will matter before we are finished." Claire Morgan arrived at 9:30 with a leather portfolio under one arm and a coffee she had picked up 2 doors down. She had been my executive secretary for 22 years, which meant she handled licensing correspondence, scheduled meetings I would otherwise forget about entirely, and occasionally left a sandwich on my work table with a note that said, "Eat this," when I had been too absorbed in a movement to remember lunch. She set the portfolio on the counter. "The Vanthorpe response," she said. "They need an answer by Tuesday." "Leave it." She left it, then glanced at the pocket watch still sitting under my lamp. "New repair. Grandfather's watch, 15 years quiet, maybe more." Claire studied the watch for a moment, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. "Can you fix it?" "Probably," I said. "The mainspring looks seized, but I won't know the full picture until I open the case properly." She wrote something in her notebook and said nothing further about it. That was one of the things I had come to rely on in 22 years. Claire understood the difference between a question that needed an answer and one that was just filling space. Samuel Price called at 11:15. Samuel had been my accountant for 18 years, a careful man from Flushing, Queens, who kept his client files in color-coded binders and never told you something was wrong until he was certain it was wrong and had the documentation to prove it. "Nathan," he said without any greeting beforehand. "There's a transaction pattern in the household's accounts I want to walk you through. Nothing that requires you to cancel anything today, but I'd like to sit down early next week." I straightened up from the work table. "What kind of pattern?" "Money moving in a direction I can't square with what I have on file," he said. "It may have a simple explanation, but I'd rather show you the numbers in person." Samuel did not use the phrase, "it may have a simple explanation," unless he had already considered the simple explanations and eliminated them. "Monday morning," I said. "Monday morning," he agreed, and we hung up. I stood at the front window for a moment and looked out at Spring Street. July in Soho meant tourists with iced coffee delivery vans double-parked with their hazard lights, blinking, a woman walking a dog the approximate size of a small couch. I had watched 35 years of that street from behind this glass. The rents had tripled. The hardware store had become a wine bar. The laundromat had become a boutique hotel. The shop had stayed. My daughter Emily called at 2:20 in the afternoon. Emily was 35 and had been married to Derek Lawson for 8 years. I did not have a simple feeling about Derek. He was intelligent and personable, and he had a way of making any idea sound reasonable in the first 5 minutes of explaining it. His difficulty was that he wanted financial success the way some people want oxygen urgently, constantly, and without much patience for the slower processes that tend to produce it. A restaurant, a bar investment, a corporate events partnership, a real estate venture. Each one had started with Derek sitting across from me, with that particular energy of someone who has finally figured it out. Each one had ended with a new debt and a new explanation. But Emily loved him, and that had always been enough for me to keep showing up. When I answered, her voice had a quality I did not recognize at first. Flat. Careful. The way someone sounds when they are reading from something they wrote down. "Dad," she said, "can you come to dinner tonight? Derek and I want to talk to you about something. Victor will be there too." Victor was Derek's father. The mention of his name alongside the careful flatness of Emily's voice landed somewhere in my chest with a small, cold weight. "What kind of something?" I asked. "Just family stuff," she said. "The Mercer kitchen, 7 o'clock. The private room downstairs." She ended the call before I could ask anything else. I stood at the counter and looked at Arthur's pocket watch under the lamp. The balance wheel was still frozen mid-swing, caught between one position and the next, waiting for something to set it moving again. I put on my jacket, turned off the work table lamp, and told myself it was probably nothing. I did not believe that, but I told myself anyway. The private dining room at the Mercer kitchen was in the basement down a narrow staircase with exposed brick walls and pendant lights that cast everything in warm amber. It was the kind of room that felt intimate when you chose it yourself and suffocating when someone else had chosen it for you. I heard Victor Lawson before I saw him. "Nathan, there he is." His voice carried the particular energy of a man who had decided in advance that the evening was going to go well. He was standing when I came through the door, hand already extended, smiling the way people smile when they want you to feel like you are the guest of honor at a party you did not know was being thrown. Victor was 63, broad-shouldered with silver hair. He kept neat and an expensive watch on his left wrist that he rotated slightly whenever he wanted you to notice it. I had noticed it the first time we met and never mentioned it, which I think bothered him more than if I had said something. Derek was already seated, a glass of water in front of him and a manila folder on the table beside his plate. He stood when I came in, and the handshake he gave me was the firm, two-handed kind that men use when they want to appear more confident than they feel. Emily was at the far end of the table. She stood too, and when she leaned in to hug me, her arms held on just a half-second longer than usual. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes, when she pulled back, had the careful blankness of someone who had spent the last several hours practicing not showing anything. "Dad," she said, "I'm glad you came." "Of course I came," I said. "You asked me to." Something moved across her face at that, a flicker of something I could not quite name. She reached for her water glass with both hands and held it without drinking. We sat. A server came and took drink orders. Victor launched immediately into a story about traffic on I-95 that nobody at the table had asked to hear. Derek laughed in the right places. Emily looked at the table. I watched all of this and waited. After the server left, Derek cleared his throat and reached for the manila folder. He slid it across the table toward me. "Dad," he said, "I think you're really going to want to take a look at this. We've found a way to finally put the shop to work for the whole family." I looked at the folder. I looked at Derek. Then I opened it. The proposal was 40 pages bound with a black clip printed on heavy paper that suggested someone had paid for it to be printed somewhere other than a home office. I read the first page, then the second. Derek and Victor watched me the way people watch someone open a present they are very proud of giving. The plan was to convert the Spring Street property, the shop, the back lot, the entire footprint into a high-end nightclub and event space. The ground floor would be demolished and rebuilt. The back lot would become an outdoor terrace with a bar and a retractable roof. The sign above the door, the one that had been there since 1989, would be replaced. All of it. Gone. Derek had a partner group lined up. Victor had apparently been involved in the introductions. The projected revenue figures in the appendix were the kind of numbers that looked impressive until you understood what assumptions had been used to produce them. I closed the folder. "No," I said. Derek blinked. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He had not prepared for the word to come that quickly. Victor leaned forward with his elbows on the table, his expression shifting into something more careful. "Nathan, you haven't seen the full financial picture yet. The projected returns in the first 3 years alone." "I read the projections," I said. "Then you understand what kind of opportunity this is." Victor spread his hands, palms up, the gesture of a man presenting something reasonable. "Derek would run the operation. Emily benefits directly. This is about building something for the family. If Derek wants to open a nightclub," I said, "he should find a different building." Victor's expression tightened at the corners, but he kept his voice level. "You're sitting on one of the most valuable parcels in Soho. The neighborhood has changed, Nathan. What you're using that space for right now, I know what I'm using it for. You're repairing watches." He said it the way you would say it if you wanted someone to hear how small it sounded. "You're 60 years old, and you are spending your days repairing other people's watches in a shop that could be generating real money." Derek jumped in, his voice softer, more rehearsed. "We're not asking you to give anything up. You'd be compensated fairly. We've had the property assessed, and with your name still attached to the venue." "My name is not a venue," I said. The table went quiet for exactly 2 seconds, and then Victor pushed his chair back and stood up. Not slowly, not gradually, He stood up the way a man stands up when he has decided that patience is no longer serving him. He pointed at me across the table and his voice dropped into something harder. "A broke old man with no right to refuse," he said. "Do you understand what Derek is offering you? If it weren't for your daughter marrying into this family, nobody at this table would give a damn about that crumbling little shop of yours." I felt Emily flinch to my left, a small, involuntary pulling in of her shoulders, like someone who hears a sound they were already bracing for. I looked at Victor. Then I looked at Derek, who was staring at the tablecloth and turning his water glass in small circles with his thumb and forefinger. Then I looked at Emily. She was gripping the edge of the table with both hands. Her knuckles had gone pale. Her lower lip was pressed so hard against her upper lip that the skin around her mouth had gone white. Her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears, yet the place just before tears, where everything is still being held in by sheer effort. I waited for her to say something. I waited for her to look at Victor and tell him that he did not speak to her father that way. That was what I waited for. Victor reached for his coffee cup. I saw his hand move toward it, and some part of me registered the motion without assigning it any particular meaning. Because people reach for coffee cups constantly. It is one of the most ordinary gestures in the world, and my mind was still on Emily, still waiting for her to find her voice. The coffee hit my chest and neck in a single shocking wave of heat. It was not boiling. The cup had been sitting long enough to cool slightly, but it was hot enough that I gasped and pressed back against my chair. The liquid spread across my shirt and soaked through immediately, and the skin on my collarbone and the left side of my neck started burning with a sharp, insistent heat that made my eyes water. Derek was on his feet. "Dad, what are you doing?" I heard his voice as though from a slight distance, because most of my attention was on the burning and on trying to breathe evenly and on not reaching up to claw at my neck the way every instinct was telling me to. I reached for a cloth napkin and pressed it against my collarbone. I looked down at my shirt. Then I looked up at Emily. Her hands were still on the edge of the table. Her eyes were wide and bright, and her chest was rising and falling fast, the way someone breathes when they are fighting very hard to stay in one piece. But she had not moved. She had not stood up. She had not said a single word. That was the thing that burned worse than the coffee. I was still pressing the napkin to my neck when the door to the private room opened. Claire Morgan had a way of reading a room in under 3 seconds. She stepped through the doorway, took in my wet shirt, the napkin pressed against my collarbone, the coffee cup still sitting at Victor's place, setting, and the particular quality of silence that follows something that cannot be taken back. Her expression did not change dramatically. Her jaw tightened by perhaps 2 millimeters, which on Claire was the equivalent of anyone else throwing a chair. She crossed the room to me first. "Now, are you burned?" she asked, her voice low and direct the way she spoke when she needed an honest answer quickly. "I'm all right," I said. She looked at my neck anyway, leaning slightly to check the skin above my collar. The burn was already turning red. I could feel the heat radiating off it in pulses. She straightened up and turned toward Victor. "Do you understand what you just did to him?" she said. Victor stared at her, his chin lifted. "And who exactly are you?" Claire set her leather portfolio on the table, opened it with 2 practiced movements, and withdrew a single page. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "My name is Claire Morgan," she said. "I am the executive secretary of Nathan Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Horology. The man you just threw coffee on holds 17 active patents in mechanical watchmaking. His designs have been licensed by manufacturers in Switzerland, Germany, and Japan. They appear in tens of thousands of timepieces sold across 4 continents. The shop you want to demolish is where every one of those patents began. She paused. I came to drop off documents for a business meeting. I did not expect to find my employer covered in coffee in a basement in Soho. The room became very still. Derek's face had gone the color of old paste. His mouth was slightly open, and his eyes moved from Claire to me and back to Claire, with the rapid, unsteady quality of someone recalculating something very quickly and not liking the new total. Victor set the coffee cup down on the table. The small ceramic sound it made was the loudest thing in the room. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not embarrassment exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that moved through his face and was gone before he could decide what to do with it. I did not feel triumphant. My neck was burning, my shirt was ruined, and I was standing in a basement restaurant holding a wet napkin, and none of what Claire had just said made any of that feel like a victory. It just made it more exhausting. I looked at Emily. She had pushed her chair back from the table slightly, both hands now in her lap, her fingers twisted together. Her eyes were red at the corners, the particular redness that comes not from crying, but from the sustained effort of not crying. Her lower lip trembled once visibly before she pressed her lips together and stopped it. "Emily," I said, "how long have you known they were planning this?" Her throat moved. She looked down at the table, then back up at me. "Dad?" "That's not an answer." Her chin dropped. Her shoulders curved inward, and she pulled her hands up from her lap and pressed them flat against the table in front of her, as though she needed something solid to hold on to. "I found out a few weeks ago," she said, her voice barely carrying across the table. "Derek told me it was going to be good for everyone. He said you'd understand once you saw the numbers." The heat in my neck pulsed again. I looked at my daughter, her red eyes, her pressed lips, her hands flat on the table, and I understood that she had known and that she had come to this dinner anyway, and that when Victor reached for that cup, she had stayed in her chair. I folded the napkin, set it on the table, and picked up my jacket from the back of my chair. "I'll call you tomorrow," I said to Emily. I did not say anything to Victor or Derek. There was nothing I wanted to say to either of them that would have been worth saying in that room on that evening with my shirt still wet against my skin. Claire walked out with me. In the narrow stairwell, she touched my arm briefly. "Do you want me to call someone?" "No," I said. "I want to go home." We stepped out onto Mercer Street. The July night was warm and close, the kind of heat that stays in the pavement after a hot day and radiates back up at you after dark. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the outside air, which smelled like exhaust and restaurant grease and the faint sweetness of something baking somewhere nearby. My car was parked 2 blocks south. Claire walked with me to the corner, then stopped. "I'll have everything ready by Monday morning," she said. "Thank you, Claire." She nodded, once turned and walked back toward the restaurant without another word. I watched her go, then continued south alone. In the car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine. The burn on my neck had settled into a steady, insistent throb. I rolled down the window to let in the night air and reached into the glove compartment for the small stack of mail I had picked up from the shop's mailbox that afternoon and hadn't gotten around to opening. Most of it was the usual parts supplier catalog, a renewal notice for a trade publication, a water bill. But the fourth envelope was different. Heavier paper. The return address was a bank in Midtown Manhattan that I did not recognize. The mailing address on the front was the shop on Spring Street. I tore it open. I read the first paragraph. Then I read it again more slowly to make sure I had understood correctly. The letter was a confirmation notice from the bank's commercial lending division. It stated that a loan application had been received for a commercial mortgage against the property at my Spring Street address. The applicant listed was Derek Lawson. Attached to the application was a signed authorization document bearing my name. I had never signed any authorization document. I had never spoken to this bank. I had never agreed to anything. I sat in the car on Mercer Street with the letter in my hands and the burn still throbbing on my neck. And I thought about Derek's face when Claire had finished speaking, that rapid, recalculating look. I thought about the 40-page proposal with its heavy paper and its revenue projections. I thought about Emily's hands pressed flat on the table. I took out my phone and called Claire. She picked up on the second ring. "Read me your evening," she said before I could speak. "I need you at the shop tomorrow morning," I said. "Early. Bring Samuel." A beat of quiet. "How early?" 8 o'clock. "I'll be there at 7:45, she said, and hung up. Claire was already at the shop when I arrived at 7:58 Saturday morning, sitting on the front step with a coffee in each hand and the leather portfolio across her knees. She stood when she saw me coming down Spring Street, handed me one of the coffees without a word, and waited while I unlocked the door. Samuel Price arrived 4 minutes later, carrying a canvas briefcase that he had owned for at least a decade and refused to replace, because as he had once explained to me, a briefcase that still closes properly is a briefcase that still does its job. He was 58, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead, and the particular unhurried manner of a man who had learned long ago that rushing through numbers produced errors, and errors produced problems far larger than whatever time you thought you had saved. He set the briefcase on my work table, snapped it open, and looked at the manila folder Claire had placed beside it, the proposal Derek had left behind, on the table at the Mercer kitchen. "This is what they brought to dinner?" Samuel asked. "That's it," I said. He opened it, put on his glasses, and began reading. Claire opened her laptop. I stood at the front window with my coffee and watched the Saturday morning foot traffic on Spring Street, dog walkers, a family with a stroller, a man in running clothes who looked like he deeply regretted his life choices. Samuel spoke first. "Nathan." His voice had the flat, careful quality it got when he had found something he did not like. "The investment group listed on page 12. I want to check something." He typed briefly on his phone, then set it down on the table and took his glasses off. "The LLC they're using as the development entity, Lawson Capital Ventures, was registered with the New York Department of State in December of last year." I turned from the window. "How long ago is that?" 7 months, Samuel said. "Give or take a week." The coffee in my hand suddenly tasted like nothing. Derek had sat across from me at that table and presented this as a new idea, something he and Victor had been putting together recently, an opportunity that had come together over the past few weeks. 7 months was not a few weeks. 7 months was a plan. Claire looked up from her laptop. "There's more." She turned the screen toward me. The offering documents they used to approach investors, I pulled them from the public filing. Victor described the Spring Street property as a family asset in transition. She pointed to a specific line on the screen. That phrase, "in transition," it implies the transfer is already underway. Investors reading this would assume the property was essentially theirs. My chest tightened the way it does when something shifts from bad to worse, and you feel the new weight of it before your mind has fully processed what it means. "They told investors the shop was already being handed over," I said. That is what this language implies," Claire said. Samuel was already back in the folder, moving through it page by page with the systematic thoroughness that made him valuable and occasionally maddening. He stopped near the back and tapped a page with his forefinger. "One on this deposit receipt," he said. "Page 31. It's from a demolition contractor in Brooklyn. Lawson Capital Ventures. $5,800 dated 10 days ago." He looked up at me over his glasses. They put a deposit on a demolition crew, Nathan. The scheduled start date is next Friday. Next Friday. 7 days from today. They had scheduled workers to come into my shop and begin tearing it apart before they had sat down to dinner with me. Before they had shown me a single page of that proposal. They had not been asking me. They had been informing me, and only because they needed my signature on a piece of paper that the bank was apparently already expecting. I set my coffee cup down on the counter because my hand had started to feel unsteady, and I did not want either of them to see it. The telephone on the wall rang. I looked at it. Saturday morning shop closed, the number only on the door and the letterhead. I picked it up. Whitmore Clock and Watch Repair. I said, "Yeah, hi?" A man's voice, businesslike, slightly impatient. "I'm trying to reach whoever handles billing for the Spring Street demo job. I've got an outstanding balance on the contract. The second payment was supposed to come through Thursday, and I've got nothing. The billing address on file is your location, so I figured I'd try the number." I kept my voice level. "What's the name on the contract?" "Lawson Capital Ventures." "Job address is the same as yours. I've got a crew scheduled for next Friday. I need the balance cleared before we mobilize, otherwise I'm pulling the team." "How much is outstanding?" I asked. $4,200. The deposit cleared, but that's it." "I understand," I said. "I'll have someone call you back within the hour." I hung up the phone. Claire and Samuel were both watching me. Claire's hands had gone still on her keyboard. Samuel had taken his glasses off entirely and was holding them in one hand, waiting. "That was the demolition contractor," I said. "Derek listed this address as the billing contact. They have a crew scheduled for next Friday. They need the remaining balance before they'll mobilize." Claire's jaw tightened, that same 2mm shift I had seen in the basement of the Mercer kitchen. "He used your shop's phone number as the contact for a crew he hired to tear your shop down." "Yes," I said. "That is what he did." Samuel put his glasses back on, reached into his briefcase, and withdrew a yellow legal pad. He wrote something at the top, then looked up. "I want to pull the loan records from the promissory note, the $120,000 you gave Derek 3 years ago. I had the original on file. There was a purpose clause." He wrote something else. "If the funds went somewhere other than the restaurant lease obligations, we have a breach of contract claim. I need to verify where the money actually went." "How long will that take?" I asked. "A few hours," Samuel said. "Maybe less." My phone buzzed on this counter. A text from Emily. 4 words. "Can we talk today?" I looked at the message for a long moment. My neck still ached from the night before, a dull, persistent reminder that sat just below the collar of my shirt. I thought about her hands pressed flat on the table. I thought about her voice. "Derek said you'd understand once you saw the numbers." I typed back, "Come to the shop this afternoon. 1 o'clock. Then I put the phone face down on the counter and looked out the front window at the street. After I put the phone down, I did something I had not planned to do. I walked away from the counter, away from Samuel's legal pad and Claire's laptop and the manila folder with its 40 pages of other people's plans, and I just moved through the shop slowly, the way you move through a place when you are trying to remember why it matters. The work table in the back was where I had spent the better part of 35 years. The surface was scarred with small marks from tools and the occasional dropped part, and the wood had darkened over time from oil and use until it had a color that no furniture store could replicate. Margaret had bought it at an estate sale in Astoria in 1991, hauled it home in a borrowed pickup truck, and announced that it was exactly the right height. She had been correct. It had always been exactly the right height. The display cases along the left wall held 12 pieces currently waiting for pickup, each one tagged with a small paper label in my handwriting. The glass had a small crack in the corner of the second case from the left, the result of a customer who had not realized the door opened outward. I had been meaning to replace it for 3 years. The chair by the front window was the one Emily had used when she was small and came to the shop after school to do her homework while I worked. She used to drag it closer to the window in winter so she could watch the snow. She had outgrown it by the time she was 12, but the chair had stayed. I stood in the middle of the room and thought about a demolition crew arriving next Friday, with tools designed to take all of this apart in a matter of hours. My throat tightened until I had to swallow twice to clear it. Nathan. Claire's voice came from behind me, careful and quiet. You need to see this. I turned around. She had her laptop angled toward me, and on the screen was a web page, the online edition of the New York Real Estate Weekly, dated 2 days ago. The headline read, Soho Family Transfer Deal Points to Mixed-Use Development Opportunity on Spring Street. I crossed the room and read it. The article was 4 paragraphs. It described an unnamed family-held property on Spring Street as being in the process of transitioning to a development group with plans for a high-end hospitality venue. It quoted an unnamed source close to the deal who described the project as already in advanced stages of planning. The address was not printed directly, but any real estate professional who knew Soho would recognize the description immediately. Victor had called a reporter before I had said yes to anything, before I had even seen the proposal. He had called a reporter and told them the deal was done. He published this to make it harder for you to back out. Claire said, her voice flat with a kind of controlled anger that was more unsettling than shouting. Once it's in print, backing away looks like a failure. He was counting on you not wanting to look like you killed something the family had already announced. My hands curled at my sides. I uncurled them deliberately. Samuel looked up from his legal pad. There's one more thing. He turned several pages and held the pad toward me. I found a permit filing from April, a 1-day commercial access permit for the Spring Street address. The applicant listed is a company called Meridian Property Assessment. I checked their website. They do interior valuation surveys. Someone came into the shop in April, I said. According to the permit, yes. A Friday afternoon. Samuel checked his notes. April 11th. April 11th was the afternoon I had driven to Midtown for the Vanthorpe meeting. I had been gone for 4 hours. When I came back, 2 or 3 tools on my work table had been in slightly different positions than I had left them. I had assumed I had moved them myself without thinking the way you do when your hands are on automatic and your mind is somewhere else. I had not moved them. Someone had stood at my work table. They had looked at Margaret's tools at the machines along the back wall at 35 years of accumulated equipment, and they had written down numbers. Dollar amounts. Estimated sale values. They had turned everything in this room into a line on a spreadsheet before Derek had ever sat down across from me at a dinner table and asked for my blessing. The burning sensation in my throat was back sharper this time. They priced it, I said. Before they asked me. They already had it priced. Claire nodded once. Her eyes were steady, but her jaw was doing that thing again, the thing it did when she was holding something in. My phone buzzed on the counter. I picked it up. Emily's name was on the screen, but this time it was not a text. She was calling. I answered. Dad. Her voice came through tight and uneven, the way voices sound when the owner has been crying recently and is trying very hard not to let it show. I need to come in earlier. Can I come now? I need to show you something about my bank account, and I can't wait until 1 o'clock. I heard her breath catch on the other end of the line, once sharp like someone stepping on something unexpected in the dark. "Come now," I said. "I'll unlock the front door." Emily arrived 11 minutes later. She came through the front door with her purse clutched against her side, and her eyes already red and swollen, the kind of red that comes from crying in a car on the way somewhere. She was wearing the same clothes she'd had on at dinner the night before, dark blouse, gray slacks, which meant she had not gone home or had gone home and not slept or both. Claire and Samuel gathered their things quietly and moved to the back of the shop. I appreciated that without saying so. I pulled 2 stools up to the front counter. Emily sat down, set her purse on the glass, and took out her phone. Her hands were shaking a fine, persistent tremor that she was clearly trying to control and clearly failing to. She opened her banking app, turned the screen toward me, and pressed her lips together so hard they went white. "Look at the transfers," she said. I looked. For 8 months, beginning in November of the previous year, Emily's salary deposits had been redirected into an account she did not have access to. The account was in Derek's name alone. Every 2 weeks, her paycheck cleared and then moved automatically cleanly without a single flag into a separate account that she could see on the shared household view but could not touch. The running total across 8 months was $34,200. I set the phone down on the counter. "He told me it was a joint savings account," Emily said, her voice fracturing on the last 2 words. "He said we were saving for a bigger place. He said he was managing it so we wouldn't spend it on stupid things." She laughed once, a short, broken sound that had nothing happy in it. "I never asked for the login. I just trusted him." "Emily, I know." She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. "I know, Dad. I know what it sounds like. I wasn't going to say that." She looked up at me. Her eyes were filling again, and she blinked rapidly, furiously, like she was angry at herself for it. "What were you going to say?" she asked. "I was going to ask about the paper you signed," I said. "The one confirming I'd promised to leave you the shop." The color drained from her face so completely and so quickly that I reached out instinctively and put my hand on the counter between us, not touching her, just close. "Derek said it was just for the investors," she said. Her voice had dropped to almost nothing. "He said it wasn't a legal document. He said it was just to make them feel more confident about the deal. He said you'd never even know about it." "How long ago did you sign it?" 3 months ago." She closed her eyes. 2 tears ran down her face in quick succession, and she didn't wipe them, just let them go like she'd run out of the energy to manage even that. I didn't think it would become this. I thought it was paperwork. I thought Derek had it figured out." "Emily." I waited until she opened her eyes. "Why did you keep his text messages, the ones where he asked you to convince me?" She exhaled slowly. "After I found the account last week, I went back through everything. All of it. 3 years of messages." She reached up and pressed her fingers against her forehead, like she was trying to hold something in place. "I read them differently when I wasn't in the middle of it. I didn't delete them because I didn't know what I was going to need. I just knew I wasn't ready to let them go." I looked at my daughter for a long moment. The red eyes, the shaking hands, the blouse she'd been wearing since last night. She had known something was wrong for at least a week. She had carried it alone. "Your silence wasn't neutrality," I said. "Every time you said nothing, you made a choice." She flinched. A small, sharp movement like a needle. Then her chin dropped to her chest, and her shoulders curved inward, and she cried. Not the controlled, blinking kind from before, But the real kind, the kind that takes over your breathing and makes your whole body shake with it. I did not tell her it was all right. It wasn't all right, and she was too old for me to pretend otherwise. I reached across the counter and put my hand over hers, and held it there until the worst of it passed. After a while, her breathing steadied. She straightened up, pressed her sleeve against her face, and looked at me with an expression that was exhausted and ashamed, and underneath both of those things, something that looked very slightly like relief. My phone rang on the counter. "Claire," I answered. "Oh, Nathan," she said without preamble. "I found an email Victor sent to a friend last month. You need to hear this." A brief pause. Then she read it aloud. "Nathan always caves because of Emily. All it takes is letting her cry. What you are about to hear next stopped me cold the first time I understood it fully. Before I tell you what Victor actually wrote about me in that email and what it reveals about everything that came before, it dropped the word 'still' in the comments right now. Just that one word. It tells me you are still here, and that matters to me more than you know. A quick note. Some elements of the stories on this channel have been shaped for depth and reflection. If that is not the kind of content you are looking for right now, it is completely fine to step away. I only want you here if this is serving you. After Emily left, I read Victor's email 3 times. The first time I read it quickly, the way you read something when you are hoping you misunderstood it. The second time I read it slowly, the way you read something when you know you did not misunderstand it, but need a moment before you can accept that. The third time I read it without any particular purpose, except that I was not yet ready to put it down. Nathan always caves because of Emily. All it takes is letting her cry. I set my phone face down on the work table. Outside Spring Street had settled into its Saturday evening rhythm. The dinner crowd starting to fill the restaurants, yellow cab headlights moving slowly through the July dusk. I had watched 10,000 Saturday evenings from behind that window. This one felt different in a way I could not have explained to anyone who had not spent the last 24 hours in my shoes. I picked up the phone and called my attorney. Patricia Okafor had handled my business affairs for 14 years. She was methodical, direct, and had a gift for explaining complicated legal situations in plain language without making you feel talked down to. "Tell me everything," she said, "and don't leave out the parts that make you look bad." I told her everything. The dinner, the proposal, the coffee, the bank letter, the demolished schedule, the forged signature, the article, the appraisal permit, Emily's redirected salary, the signed paper. I talked for 20 minutes without stopping. When I finished, there was a brief silence on the line, the working kind, not the uncomfortable kind. "All right," Patricia said. "Here's where we start. The bank letter first that forged authorization is federal mortgage fraud. I'm going to contact the lender directly and put them on notice that no authorization was ever given. They'll flag the application immediately." She paused. "The demolition contract, do you have the contractor's number?" "Yes. Don't call them yet. Let me send a formal notice first. It's cleaner." Another pause. The promissory note, Samuel mentioned a purpose clause. "Funds to be used solely for outstanding lease obligations on the restaurant property," I said. "And the money went to Victor's LLC instead. 60,000 of it, according to Samuel's preliminary review." "No." "Then Derek breached the loan terms the day that transfer cleared," Patricia said. "Under the acceleration clause in a standard promissory note, the entire remaining balance becomes immediately due. I'll draft the demand letter tonight." After we hung up, I sat at the work table and thought about Emily pressing her hand against her forehead in that particular way she had when she was trying to hold herself together. I thought about the chair by the window where she used to do her homework. I thought about a demolition crew showing up next Friday with equipment designed to reduce all of this to rubble in a matter of hours. My chest ached with something I did not have a clean word for. Samuel called at 7:40. "I finished the loan review," he said. $62,400 transferred to Lawson Capital Ventures between March and May of this year. The purpose clause is explicit. The funds were designated for restaurant lease obligations only. There's no ambiguity. "Thank you, Samuel. There's one more thing." He shuffled papers on his end of the line. I went back through the gala investment documents Claire pulled. "There's a contract in the appendix I want you to look at. It appears to be a transfer agreement for the Spring Street property. Derek's name is listed as the receiving party. It's fully drafted, Nathan, every clause. It's just waiting for a signature." I closed my eyes for a moment. They had not put that contract together after dinner last night. They had not put it together last week. That document had been sitting in a folder, finished and ready for months. The dinner had never been a proposal. It had been a signing ceremony they had arranged without telling me I was the one expected to sign. Claire arrived at 8:15 with her laptop and a folder she had printed at home. She spread the pages across the work table without preamble. "Witnessed verbal agreement," she said, pointing to a stapled document. "Derek hired a man named Paul Garrity to serve as a witness. Garrity has signed a statement claiming that you verbally agreed in a private meeting to transfer the shop to Derek in principle." Claire looked up at me. "Garrity has worked for Victor Lawson's company for 6 years. "What does Patricia say about it?" I asked. "I already sent it to Patricia." Claire pulled her reading glasses down from her forehead. Her words were, "This document is a pressure tactic, not a legal weapon. Under New York Statute of Frauds, any agreement to transfer real property must be in writing to be enforceable. A witness statement about a verbal agreement means nothing in court. What it's designed to do is frighten you into signing the real contract before you talk to a lawyer." I looked at the statement. Paul Garrity. 6 years with Victor's company. "They built the whole thing before they sat down to dinner," I said. "Yes," Claire said. "They did." She reached for a second page. "Victor called Rita this afternoon. His wife. He asked her to call you tomorrow morning to appeal to you as a family member. He told her you were being stubborn and that you needed to hear from someone you trusted." I looked at the page Claire had set in front of me. Rita Lawson was 60 years old and had, as far as I had ever been able to tell, no involvement in her husband's business decisions. She brought homemade pie to family dinners and grew tomatoes on her back porch in Greenwich, and had once spent an entire Thanksgiving explaining to me why her recipe for sweet potato casserole was superior to every other recipe in human history. She was not a bad person. She was a person Victor had decided to use. "What time is she planning to call?" I asked. "He told her first thing in the morning," Claire said. I nodded slowly. "Then I'll be here when she does." The call came at 8:03 Sunday morning. I was at the work table with a cup of coffee and the pocket watch I had taken in on Friday. Arthur's watch, the one that had been silent for 15 years. I had the case open and the movement exposed under the lamp, and I was not really working on it so much as giving my hands something to do while I waited. When the phone rang, I picked it up on the second ring. "Nathan." Rita Lawson's voice was warm, the way it always was, a particular unhurried warmth that reminded me of someone who had learned a long time ago that most things worth saying did not need to be rushed. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "You're not," I said. "Good morning, Rita." "Good morning." A brief pause, the comfortable kind. "I wanted to call because, well, Victor mentioned that things got a little tense at dinner Friday. He said you and Derek were having some trouble seeing eye to eye, and he thought it might help to hear from someone a little more neutral. She laughed softly, a self-deprecating sound. I'm not sure I qualify as neutral, but I thought I'd try. Her voice was so genuinely kind that something tightened in my chest. Not anger, but something closer to grief. She had no idea. She was sitting in her house in Greenwich on a Sunday morning, probably at the kitchen table where she always drank her first cup of coffee, and she was making this call because her husband had asked her to, and because she believed in good faith that she was helping. Rita, I said carefully. Did Victor ask you to call me this morning? A small pause. He mentioned it might be a good idea. What exactly did he tell you happened at dinner? He said Derek presented a business opportunity and that you weren't receptive. He said you left upset and that, well, that things were said that shouldn't have been. Another pause, more uncertain this time. He said you might be more comfortable hearing from family. I looked at the pocket watch on the table in front of me. The balance wheel sat frozen mid-swing, the same as it had been when the man first brought it in, caught between one position and the next. Rita, I said, I'm going to tell you what actually happened, and I'm going to ask you to listen to all of it before you respond. Can you do that? A quiet beat. Of course, I told her. Not everything, not the legal details, not Margaret's name, not the demand letters being drafted, but the shape of it. The 40-page proposal Victor and Derek had been preparing for 7 months without telling me. The demolition crew with a deposit paid and a start date scheduled for next Friday. The offering documents that described my shop as a family asset already in transition. The forged signature on the bank application. The $62,000 that had gone from my account into Victor's LLC. Emily's salary redirected for 8 months into an account she could not access. I spoke evenly without raising my voice, without editorializing. I gave Rita the facts the way Samuel gave me facts, in order with specifics without drama. When I finished, the line was quiet for a long moment. Not the comfortable quiet from the beginning of the call. A different kind, entirely the kind that has weight to it, that presses down on both people at once. The signature on the bank application. Rita said finally, her voice different now, careful in a new way. You're saying that's not your signature? It's not my signature, I said. I have never spoken to that bank. I have never authorized anything. Another silence. I heard her exhale a long, slow breath that sounded like something leaving her. And Emily's account, she said. The salary. 8 months, I said. $34,000. She didn't know she couldn't access it until last week. Rita made a small sound, not quite a word, just a sound, the kind that escapes before you can decide whether to let it out. Then she said very quietly, I didn't know any of this. I know you didn't, I said, and I meant it completely. Whatever Victor had done, Rita was not part of it. She had called me this morning because she loved her family, and her husband had told her it would help, and she had believed him. That was the whole of it. Nathan, she said. Her voice had steadied, but underneath the steadiness, there was something new, a tightness, a careful, private kind of anger that she was clearly not ready to show to me. I'm sorry he asked me to make this call. You didn't know, I said again. That's enough. We said goodbye and hung up. I sat at the work table and looked at Arthur's pocket watch. I picked up the smallest of my screwdrivers and turned it slowly in my fingers without using it. Rita would not call me back. She would not tell me what she said to Victor or whether she said anything at all. She was a private woman, and whatever happened in her house in Greenwich after she put down that phone was between her and her husband. But I thought about the sound she had made, that small, involuntary sound, before she caught herself, and I thought that Victor had made a mistake when he chose to use her. 15 minutes later, I heard a knock at the front door. I looked up through the front window. The shop was closed. The sign turned the blinds half drawn against the morning sun. A man was standing on the front step with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the door with the expression of someone who has rehearsed what they are going to say and is no longer entirely sure it is enough. Derek. Without his father, I opened the front door. Derek stepped inside without being invited, which told me something about how he had prepared for this. He had rehearsed an entrance, not a request. He was wearing a pale blue shirt with the collar open and dark slacks, and he looked like a man who had slept badly but had taken care to not look like it, the kind of careful grooming that takes longer than usual precisely because you are trying to hide that it took any effort at all. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Without my father." I stepped back from the door and let him come in. I did not offer him coffee. I moved behind the front counter and stood there, and Derek stayed on the customer side, which put the glass display case between us, which seemed right. He ran one hand through his hair, then caught himself doing it, and put his hand back at his side. I want you to know that the dinner on Friday, the way it went, that's not what I wanted." His voice had the particular careful quality of someone who has decided that sincerity is the most strategic option available. My father gets aggressive when he thinks something isn't moving fast enough. The coffee, what he said to you, I was horrified. I want you to know that. "All right," I said. This whole thing started as a legitimate business idea. I genuinely believed it could work. A venue at that address with the right backing, it's a real opportunity, Nathan. I still believe that. He paused and something shifted in his expression, a move toward vulnerability carefully calibrated. But the way my father has handled it, the pressure he's put on Emily, some of the documents that got prepared. He shook his head with what appeared to be genuine distress. I didn't know the extent of it until recently. He runs ahead. He always has. I should have kept better control of what he was doing in my name. I watched him deliver all of this and found myself thinking that he was genuinely very good at it. The pauses were right. The eye contact was right. The small admission of fault, "I should have kept better control," was precisely measured to suggest accountability without actually accepting it. I almost said something. Then I heard Claire's footsteps from the back of the shop. She came around the end of the work table carrying a single printed page. She set it on the counter in front of me without a word, turned it so I could read it, and stepped back. It was an email. The sender was Derek Lawson. The recipients were 3 names I did not recognize, the investment partners, I assumed. The date was March 14th of this year, 4 months ago. The subject line read, "Spring Street Timeline Confirmation." The body of the email was 3 sentences. "I've confirmed with the property owner that we're on track for Q3 transfer. Once the father-in-law signs, we'll clear out the workshop equipment in the first week. Full demo starts the following Monday." I read it once. Then I picked it up and held it across the counter toward Derek. He looked at it. The careful sincerity drained out of his face the way color drains from skin when the body understands something before the mind catches up. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved from the page to me, and then to the middle distance somewhere above my left shoulder. "That was," he started. "March 14th, I said. 4 months ago, 3 sentences. Once the father-in-law signs, we'll clear out the workshop equipment in the first week." Derek's mouth closed. "You wrote that," I said. "Not your father. You." He set the page back down on the counter. His hand was not entirely steady when he did it, and I noticed that, and I think he noticed that I noticed. He pulled his hand back and stood up straighter, the way people do when they are trying to recover something they have already lost. "That email was about logistics," he said. "I was keeping the investors informed. It doesn't mean... It means you told your investors the transfer was already confirmed in March," I said. "Before you sat down to dinner with me on Friday, before you showed me a single page of that proposal, you told them it was done." Derek looked at the counter. His shoulders dropped half an inch, a small, involuntary surrender that his posture made before the rest of him caught up. His jaw worked for a moment, the muscles along the side of his face tightening and releasing. "I thought..." He started, then stopped. "What did you think?" I asked. He didn't answer. He pressed his lips together and looked at a point somewhere on the glass counter between us, and I could see the moment when he understood that there was no version of this conversation he had prepared, for that was going to work. I put the email face down on the counter. "Is there anything else you want to tell me?" I said, before I hear it from someone else. Derek looked up at me. His eyes were tired and cornered, and underneath the tiredness, something that might have been briefly, incompletely, something like shame. He shook his head. That was the most honest thing he had said since he walked through the door. After he left, my phone buzzed on the counter. "Samuel. Nathan," he said. "The appraiser Derek hired, I found the access permit. The applicant on the filing is listed as Meridian Property Assessment. They came to your shop on April 11th. That was the afternoon of the Vanthorpe meeting." A pause. "There's something else." I pulled the ownership breakdown on the LLC again. Victor holds 70%. Derek holds 30%. The operating agreement gives Victor sole decision-making authority on all transactions above $5,000. I set the phone down for a moment and looked at the front window. Derek had been told he would own all of it. He had been pushing me toward a door that his father controlled entirely from the other side. After Samuel hung up, I stood at the front counter for a long moment, with my hand still resting on the phone. 70%. Victor held 70% of the company, with sole authority over every decision above $5,000. Derek had spent months pushing me toward a deal that his father controlled entirely. He had pressured Emily, redirected her salary, put her name on documents she did not understand, and at the end of all of it, if the project had succeeded, Victor would have held the controlling interest, and Derek would have had 30 cents on every dollar. I picked up the appraisal list Samuel had left on the work table and walked slowly through the shop. The list was 4 pages single-spaced, organized by category. Clockmaking equipment display cases referenced library specialty tools. Each line had a description, an estimated condition rating, and a dollar figure beside it. Someone had stood in this room and reduced everything in it to a spreadsheet. I stopped at the long work table in the back. The appraisal listed it as antique workbench, solid oak, circa 1890s good condition, estimated value $800 to $1,200. $800 to $1,200. Margaret had driven a borrowed pickup truck to Astoria on a Saturday morning in February of 1991 to bring this table home. She had measured the doorframe 3 times before they tried to get it through. She had laughed when it fit with less than an inch to spare on each side, that particular laugh she had when something worked out after she had refused to believe it wouldn't. The appraisal did not mention any of that. It did not have a column for it. I moved to the display cases along the left wall. 3 glass display cases, commercial grade, minor crack, noted in Unit 2, estimated value $200 to $300 per unit. I moved to the shelves on the right. Reference library approximately 240 volumes mixed condition estimated value as lot $400. I set the list down on top of the second display case and pressed both palms flat against the glass. The crack in the corner caught the afternoon light the way it always did at this time of day. A thin, pale line that I had been meaning to fix for 3 years, and now for some reason was very glad I had not. Claire came to stand beside me. She did not say anything. She looked at the crack in the glass, and then at the list on top of the case. "He had someone in here in April," I said. "While I was at the Vanthorpe meeting. They walked through this room and wrote down numbers." "Yes," Claire said. "And the whole time Victor was telling Derek he'd own all of it. 70-30, and Derek didn't know." Claire's expression did not change, but something moved behind her eyes, a kind of cold, focused anger that she had been carrying since Friday night, and was by now very good at managing. "Samuel found something else this afternoon," she said. "Victor has 2 outstanding debt positions in California, a failed hotel development in San Diego and a commercial lease dispute in Los Angeles. Combined exposure is approximately $1.4 million. I looked at her. The nightclub wasn't an opportunity for Derek. "No," Claire said. "It was a way for Victor to generate enough capital to cover his California losses without his creditors finding out he needed to." She paused. "Derek was the face of the project. If it succeeded, Victor took the money. If it failed, Derek took the blame." The afternoon light moved across the floor of the shop, the way it always did at this hour, a slow, amber slide from the front window toward the back wall. I had watched that light move across this floor for 35 years. My phone buzzed on the counter, a text from a number I did not recognize. "Mr. Whitmore, this is Ryan Lawson, Derek's younger brother. I think you deserve to know what I did. I'd like to talk to you in person if you're willing. I'm sorry to contact you this way." I read the message twice. Ryan Lawson. I had met him at family dinners, a quiet young man in his late 20s, who seemed in the way of younger siblings everywhere, to be perpetually standing slightly outside whatever circle his older brother occupied. I typed back, "Come to the shop tonight. 8 o'clock. Come alone." Then I set the phone down and looked at the appraisal list still sitting on top of the display case. 4 pages. Every line a number. Not one of them anywhere close to what any of this was actually worth. Ryan Lawson arrived at 7:58, 2 minutes early, which told me something about how seriously he had taken the invitation. He was 29 shorter than Derek by a few inches, with the kind of face that had not yet settled into the version it would eventually become. He was wearing a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, no jacket, despite the July evening, and he stood in the doorway of the shop with his hands at his sides and his shoulders already carrying the posture of someone who has come to say something they cannot take back. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. "Come in," I said. He came in and stopped near the front counter, not sitting, not moving toward the display cases or the work table the way most people do when they enter a space for the first time. He stood exactly where he stopped, like he had decided he did not deserve to make himself comfortable. "I need to tell you about April 11th, he said. I pulled a stool out from behind the counter and sat down. "Go ahead." Ryan's throat moved. He pressed his lips together, then opened them again. "My father told me he needed someone he trusted to handle a key situation. He said it was just a preliminary survey, that they needed measurements and photographs of the interior before the project could move forward. He said it was standard." Ryan's jaw tightened. "He said you'd already agreed to the general idea and that this was just preparation." "And you believed him," I said. "I wanted to," Ryan said, and the honesty in that 2-word correction was more than I had expected from him. I knew you hadn't signed anything. I knew it wasn't clean. But my father told me there'd be a management position for me when the venue opened. Floor manager. Real salary, real responsibility. He looked down at the counter between us. I made a copy of Derek's spare key. I let the appraiser in on a Friday afternoon in April while you were at a meeting. We were inside for about 40 minutes. I thought about the afternoon I had come back from the Vanthorpe meeting to find 3 tools on my work table slightly out of position. I had assumed I had moved them without thinking. The particular wrongness of that moment, the small, nagging sense that something was off that I had talked myself out of, came back to me now with a clarity that made my stomach tighten. Someone had stood at Margaret's table, had opened drawers, had moved things with hands that had no right to be there. Did the appraiser touch anything? I asked. He photographed everything, Ryan said. He moved a few tools to get better angles. He didn't take anything. Ryan's voice cracked slightly on the last sentence, and he cleared his throat. I know that doesn't make it better. It doesn't, I said. But I appreciate you saying it anyway. Claire had been sitting quietly at the far end of the work table with her notepad. She looked up now. Under New York penal law, what happened on April 11th constitutes criminal trespass in the 2nd degree. She said, her voice even and factual. The shop is a commercial premises. Entry without authorization from the owner is a Class A misdemeanor. Your role in facilitating the entry makes you potentially liable as an accomplice. Ryan's face went pale. He nodded once, the nod of someone who had already considered this and had come anyway. I'm not going to pursue that, I said. Ryan looked up sharply. You came here and told me the truth without being asked, I said. That matters. But I need you to write down everything you just told me, the date, the key, the appraiser's name, the amount of time you were inside. Claire will give you paper. Ryan nodded again, this time with something in his expression that was close to relief, but not quite the expression of someone who understands that relief is not something they have fully earned yet. He sat down at the work table and began writing. Claire set a legal pad in front of him and uncapped a pen and placed it beside the pad, then came to stand near me. Victor called Emily 2 days ago, she said quietly. Thursday evening. She didn't tell you because she didn't want to add to what was already happening. Claire's voice dropped another register. He asked her to sign a new document confirming you had agreed verbally to the transfer. When she refused, he tried a different approach. He told her that you were going to lose the shop, regardless that the investors had legal standing, that she might as well help the process go smoothly. My hands curled against the edge of the counter. She recorded it, Claire said. She called me an hour after it happened. I have the file. I looked at Ryan, still writing at the work table, his head bent over the legal pad, the pen moving steadily. Then I looked at Claire. Play it, I said. She took out her phone, found the file, and pressed play. Victor's voice came through the speaker, warm, patient, unhurried, the voice of a man who had practiced being reasonable for so long that it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. Emily, sweetheart. Your father agreed in principle. We all know that. All we need is a simple confirmation from you, just a formality, to keep the process moving. It protects everyone, including him. My jaw tightened until I could feel it in my back teeth. Emily had sat across from him at a dinner table on Friday night and not said a word in my defense. But on Thursday alone, without telling me, she had held the phone steady and let him talk and recorded every word. That was not nothing. Claire played the recording twice. The second time I listened differently, not for what Victor was saying, but for the silences between what he was saying, the places where a different kind of man would have stopped and reconsidered. There were several of those places. Victor did not stop at any of them. By the end, Emily had asked exactly the right questions and given him nothing useful in return. She had stopped the recording at precisely the right moment. Claire pressed stop and set her phone on the work table. Ryan had finished writing his statement and left 20 minutes earlier, the legal pad folded under his arm, his expression carrying the particular weight of someone who has done the right thing too late, but has done it nonetheless. I told him to make himself available if Patricia needed to reach him. He said yes without hesitation. She did well, I said. She did very well. Claire agreed. I called Patricia at 9:15. She listened to the recording over the phone without interrupting, then said, "That's attempted fraud. He's asking her to sign a document confirming facts he knows are false under the explicit representation that it's just a formality. I'll file the recording with the bank and with the district attorney's office tomorrow morning." "Will they act on it?" I asked. "The bank will," Patricia said. "They take fraud seriously when there's audio. The DA's office that depends on other factors. But the recording establishes intent regardless. It protects you in any civil proceeding." After we hung up, Claire opened her folder and set 3 documents side by side on the work table. "I want to show you the full picture," she said. The first document was the offering memorandum, the one that described my shop as a family asset in transition and had been used to solicit investors. The second was the transfer agreement, the contract drafted in Derek's name, every clause complete, waiting only for my signature. The third was the witnessed verbal agreement signed by Paul Garrity, Victor's employee of 6 years. Claire pointed to the dates on each document. The offering memorandum, December of last year. The transfer agreement, January of this year. The witnessed verbal agreement, February. They built the legal framework before they built the business plan, Claire said. The nightclub concept came after the documents. The documents came after the decision to take the property. She looked at me steadily. This was not a business opportunity that required your cooperation. This was a property acquisition that required your signature. The difference matters. I stood at the work table and looked at the 3 documents laid out in chronological order. December, January, February. 7 months of preparation before a single word was said to me at a dinner table in a basement restaurant in Soho. My chest ached with something that had moved past anger into a territory I did not have a clean name for, the particular exhaustion of understanding fully, and finally that the thing you had been hoping was a misunderstanding was not a misunderstanding at all. I gathered the documents into a single stack and set them in Claire's folder. "Make copies of everything," I said. The recording, Ryan's statement, the offering memorandum, the transfer agreement, the Garrity document, the bank letter, the demolition contract, the appraisal permit. Everything. "Already done," Claire said. "Patricia has a full set. I have a full set. And there's a set in the fireproof cabinet in the back." I almost smiled at that. 22 years. She had thought of the fireproof cabinet before I had. My phone rang at 9:47. The screen showed Victor Lawson. I looked at it for 2 full rings before I answered. "Nathan." His voice was warm, unhurried, almost friendly, a register I had not heard from him since before Friday's dinner. "I've been thinking about the way things went this week, and I'd like to try again. I'd like to have you over for dinner Wednesday evening. Just family. Rita's been asking about you." A brief, practiced pause. "No lawyers, no documents? I think if we all sit down together without all the pressure, we can find our way through this." I looked at Claire across the work table. She had heard his voice through the phone and was watching me with an expression that asked without words what I intended to do. "What time Wednesday?" I asked. 7 o'clock, Victor said. We're in Greenwich. I'll text you the address. All right, I said. I'll be there. After I hung up, Claire raised an eyebrow. He doesn't know what we have, I said. She understood immediately. He thinks Friday was about daytime identity. He doesn't know about the recording. He doesn't know Ryan came in tonight. He doesn't know Patricia has filed anything. She reached for her portfolio and began organizing the folder. He thinks he's still managing the situation. Yes, I said. Bring everything Wednesday. The drive from Manhattan to Greenwich on a Wednesday evening took 45 minutes. I took I-95 north out of the city, past the Bronx, across the state line, into Connecticut, the skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely behind the tree line. Claire's leather portfolio sat on the passenger seat beside me. I had texted her the address and told her to park on the street, not in the driveway, and to wait for my message before coming to the door. She had texted back 2 words. Understood. Ready. Victor's house was a colonial on a quiet cul-de-sac, white clapboard siding, black shutters, a covered porch, with 2 wicker chairs that looked like they had been placed there for appearances rather than use. The driveway held 4 cars. Through the front windows, I could see the warm glow of a dining room and the movement of people inside. I sat in my car for 90 seconds before going in. The front door was opened by Rita, who took my jacket and touched my arm and said it was good to see me in the particular way of someone who means it, and is also very carefully not saying anything else. Her eyes were watchful in a way they had not been the last time I had seen her. Whatever had happened after our phone call on Sunday had left a mark she was not yet ready to discuss. The dining room held 14 people. Victor's brothers, their wives, a pair of cousins I had met once at a Christmas party years ago, Derek and Ryan, who caught my eye from across the room and looked immediately at the floor. There was a bar cart in the corner, and candles on the table, and the particular performative warmth of a family gathering that has been arranged to make a point. Victor shook my hand at the head of the table and gestured to an open seat near the middle. "Oh, Nathan," he said with the expansive generosity of a host who has already decided how the evening will go. "I'm glad you came. Sit. I sat. The first 40 minutes were dinner, a roasted chicken, roasted potatoes, a salad that nobody touched very much. Victor talked about the summer, about a golf game he had played last weekend, about his brother's new boat. He was relaxed in the way of someone performing relaxation, every casual remark placed as carefully as furniture in a showroom. I ate and listened and said little. After the plates were cleared, Victor set his wine glass down and looked around the table with an expression that shifted from host to something more deliberate. "I wanted to get everyone together," he said, "because I think there's been a real misunderstanding this past week, and I'd rather address it with family than let it fester." He looked at me with what appeared to be genuine regret. "Nathan, I want to apologize for my behavior at dinner last Friday. What I did was wrong. I lost my temper, and I am sorry for that." Several people at the table nodded. One of the cousins murmured something approving. Victor continued, "The larger situation, the project, the property, I think what's happened is that Nathan has gotten some advice that has made him feel like this is an adversarial situation, when really it's just a family trying to find a way forward together." He paused, letting that settle. "I also want to address some of the things being said about my involvement. I've heard that there are suggestions I've been acting improperly. I want to be transparent with everyone here tonight because that's what family does." He went on for another 6 minutes. By the time he finished, he had described me as emotionally reactive, suggested that Claire was acting in her own financial interest, rather than mine. Implied that Derek's involvement had been entirely innocent, and framed the entire situation as a misunderstanding that could be resolved if I would simply agree to have a reasonable conversation. He had not mentioned the forged signature. He had not mentioned the demolition deposit. He had not mentioned the $62,000. He had not mentioned Emily's salary. When he finished, the table looked at me. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and took out my phone. I sent Claire one word, "Now." Then I set a thin folder on the table in front of me. "You said you wanted to be transparent," I said. "I brought some transparency with me." Victor's expression flickered the smallest possible movement there and gone in under a second. 30 seconds later, the front doorbell rang. One of Victor's brothers went to answer it. Claire walked into the dining room carrying her leather portfolio, and I watched Victor's face go through 4 distinct expressions in approximately 2 seconds: surprise, recognition, calculation, and something that was not quite fear, but was close enough to it that the distinction did not matter much. "Claire is not a lawyer," I said before Victor could object. "She is my executive secretary. She does not violate any agreement about tonight." Claire set the portfolio on the table, opened it, and began placing documents face up in the center of the table where everyone could see them. The first was the LLC registration for Lawson Capital Ventures. Date December of last year. The second was the offering memorandum with the phrase "family asset in transition" highlighted in yellow. The third was the demolition deposit receipt. Date 10 days before the dinner at the Mercer Kitchen. The fourth was an email from a man named Gerald Whitfield in San Diego, a former business partner of Victor's, who had contacted Claire 3 days ago. The email described 2 previous situations in which Victor had used a family member to gain access to a property he wanted to develop, then structured the deal so that the family member bore the liability while Victor retained control. I watched Victor's brothers read that email. I watched his cousins read it. I watched the careful social architecture of the evening begin to develop cracks in places Victor had not expected. "Victor," said Rita from the far end of the table. Her voice was quiet. It was the quietest voice in the room, and because of that, every person at the table heard it immediately and turned toward her. She had her hands flat on the tablecloth in front of her, and her eyes were fixed on her husband with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger exactly, not grief exactly, but the particular look of someone who has spent several days arriving at a question and has finally decided to ask it out loud. "How much of Nathan's money went into your accounts?" Nobody answered Rita's question immediately. Not because nobody wanted to, I could see the wanting in the way Victor's brother leaned forward slightly, in the way one of the cousins set down her wine glass with a small, careful click. But Rita had asked the question in a tone that made the room understand, without anyone saying so, that the answer belonged to Victor, and nobody else was going to fill the space for him. Victor set both hands flat on the table. "Rita, this isn't the right moment to—" "I think it is exactly the right moment," Rita said. Her voice had not risen. It was still the quietest voice in the room, and that quietness had a quality to it. Now that was different from the beginning of the evening. It had edges. The front door opened. Samuel Price came through it carrying his canvas briefcase, his reading glasses already on his nose, a laptop tucked under one arm. He had parked 2 streets over and walked as I had asked him to. He nodded to me once, set the laptop on the sideboard near the dining room entrance, and opened it without addressing anyone else. "This is my accountant," I said. "Samuel Price. He's been reviewing the financial records." Victor's jaw tightened. "Nathan," I said, "no lawyers." "Samuel is not a lawyer," I said. "He's an accountant. Would you like to continue?" Samuel turned his laptop so the screen faced the table. On it was a bank statement, clean, clear, the kind of document that does not require interpretation. In March, April, and May of this year, Samuel said in the unhurried voice he used when presenting numbers he was certain of. $62,400 was transferred from an account belonging to Derek Lawson into Lawson Capital Ventures, LLC. The promissory note governing the original loan of $120,000, the loan Nathan made to Derek 3 years ago, contains a purpose clause. The funds were designated solely for outstanding lease obligations on the restaurant property. He looked up over his glasses. Not $1 of the $62,000 went to any lease obligation. Every transfer went directly into the development company. Victor's brother looked at Victor. You told us Derek paid off the restaurant debt himself. He did, Victor said quickly. There were multiple accounts involved. Samuel is looking at one piece of a larger. The promissory note is one document. Samuel said with the patient precision of a man who has spent 40 years not being interrupted mid-sentence by people who do not like what he is saying. The purpose clause is one sentence. The breach is not complicated. Claire reached into her portfolio and set a second document on the table. This is a statement signed by a man named Paul Garrity. He is listed as a witness to a verbal agreement, specifically that Nathan verbally agreed to transfer the Spring Street property to Derek. She let the room read the name. Paul Garrity has been employed by Victor Lawson's company for 6 years. Victor's cousin said quietly, "Oh, the document has no legal force," Claire continued. Under New York statute of frauds, any agreement to transfer real property must be in writing and signed by the party being bound. A verbal agreement, even with a witness, is unenforceable. The purpose of this document was not to create a legal obligation. It was to create the impression of one to pressure Nathan into signing the real transfer agreement before he understood what he was signing. Victor pushed his chair back slightly. That is a mischaracterization of Victor. Rita's voice cut across his cleanly, without volume and without hesitation. Stop. He stopped. She had not looked away from him since she asked her first question. Her hands were still flat on the tablecloth, and her shoulders were straight, and there was something in her face that I recognized now that I was looking for it. The expression of a person who has spent several days turning something over in their mind and has arrived quietly and without announcement at the far side of it. Emily's salary, she said. Is what Nathan told me on Sunday correct? The table moved. Not literally, but something shifted in the room, a collective adjustment, the way people move when a conversation has reached a point from which there is no comfortable retreat. What did he tell you? Derek asked, his voice careful. That her paychecks were redirected into an account she could not access, Rita said. She looked at Derek now, not Victor. For 8 months, Derek's face went through 3 expressions in quick succession: surprise at the question, calculation about how to answer it, and then something that collapsed underneath both of those, a kind of hollowing out around the eyes that happened when a person runs out of versions of themselves to present. It was a joint saving strategy, Derek said. We discussed it. She didn't have access to it, I said. She chose not to. Derek. I kept my voice level. She didn't have the login. She asked you for it twice. You told her the account was being restructured. The room absorbed that. Victor's brother looked at his wife. The cousin who had said, "Oh," said nothing, but her expression said the same thing again, more slowly. Claire set one more document on the table. A printout of a text message thread, the messages Derek had sent Emily over 4 months, asking her to talk to me, to cry if she needed to remind me how much the family needed this. I had not planned to use these tonight, but Derek had just looked me in the eye and suggested that Emily had chosen not to access her own salary. The last message in that thread, I said, is from 6 days before the dinner at the Mercer kitchen. Derek wrote, and I'll read it exactly. Just cry in front of Dad. He can never let you cry alone. Victor's brother put his fork down on his plate with a sound that was louder than he intended. Victor opened his mouth. Don't, Rita said. He closed it. Derek broke the silence that followed Rita's don't. He did not look at his father. He looked at Samuel, and his voice had the flat, careful quality of someone who has just understood something and is not yet sure what to do with the understanding. The LLC, Derek said. Lawson Capital Ventures. What's the ownership breakdown? Samuel reached into his briefcase without hurrying and withdrew a single page, the operating agreement for Lawson Capital Ventures, filed with the New York Department of State. He set it on the table in front of Derek and stepped back. Derek picked it up. He read for approximately 15 seconds. Then the page lowered slowly, the way something lowers when the hands holding it have stopped caring about the task and started caring about something else entirely. His face had gone the color of old plaster. A muscle worked along the side of his jaw, tightening and releasing, tightening and releasing. 70%, Derek said. Not a question, just the number spoken aloud as though saying it was the only way to make it real. Victor started to speak. You told me I'd own all of it. Derek's voice cracked on the last word, a sharp, involuntary sound, like something snapping under pressure it was not designed to hold. His hand tightened around the page until the paper bent. You said once the project was running, you'd transfer full control. You said this was for me. Derek, there are tax structures involved that require 70%. Derek's voice rose now, the crack widening into something rawer. You have 70% and sole authority over every transaction above $5,000. I read it right here. I'm sitting here reading it right now. He dropped the page on the table and turned to face his father directly, and his chest was heaving with the effort of what he was trying to say and what he was trying not to say at the same time. I pushed Nathan for months. I pressured Emily. I put my name on documents that are going to follow me for the rest of my life. And you were going to keep 70%. Victor's expression cycled through several things, rapidly, defensive, calculated briefly, something that might have been genuine discomfort, before it settled on the one he had been using his entire adult life, the expression of a man who believes the situation can still be managed, if only everyone would calm down. Son, don't. Derek said it the same way Rita had said it, one word, no volume, entirely final. The table had gone completely still. Nobody reached for a wine glass. Nobody shifted in their chair. Victor's brother was looking at his hands. The cousins were looking at each other. Ryan, at the far end, was looking at the tablecloth with the focused attention of someone who would very much like to be somewhere else, and understands they have earned the discomfort of being exactly here. Emily's voice came from the doorway. I had not heard her come in. She was standing just inside the dining room entrance, still in her work clothes. She had driven up from the city. I had sent her a text 2 hours earlier. Come to Greenwich tonight. I'll explain when you get here. Her eyes were red but dry. She was holding her phone in both hands. I have something I want to read, she said. The room turned toward her. Victor started to say her name. Let her speak, Rita said from her end of the table. Emily looked at her phone screen. Her hands were trembling, a fine, visible tremor that she did not try to hide or apologize for. She read aloud. October 9th. Derek to Emily. Have you talked to your dad yet about the Spring Street idea? We need him moving in our direction. She scrolled. November 3rd. You need to work on him this weekend. Bring up how much stress this financial uncertainty is causing you. He responds to that. She scrolled again, and this time her voice tightened slightly around the words. December 14th. If he pushes back, just get emotional. You know how he is. He can't stand to see you upset. Use it. She lowered the phone. The room was silent in a way that had texture to it, the particular silence of people who have heard something they cannot unhear, and are each privately deciding what it means for them. Derek's face had collapsed entirely. The muscle in his jaw had stopped working. He was looking at Emily with an expression that had moved through shame and arrived somewhere past it, the hollow, exposed look of a person who has been seen clearly for the first time by someone they had counted on not to look too closely. "Emily," he said. Her name, just her name, with nothing useful attached to it. She put her phone in her pocket. Ryan stood up. He did not clear his throat or ask permission. He simply stood, and the movement drew every eye in the room to him, and he accepted that without flinching. "I need to tell everyone something," he said. "In April, I made a copy of Derek's key to Nathan's shop. I let a property appraiser in on a Friday afternoon while Nathan was at a business meeting." He paused. Nathan was not told. He did not agree to it. "I did it because my father offered me a job, and I took the offer without thinking about what I was helping to do." Ryan looked directly at me across the table. "I've already given Nathan a written account. I'm sorry. I should have said this sooner." The table absorbed that. Victor's brother turned to look at Victor with an expression that had nothing diplomatic left in it. At the far end of the table, Rita pushed her chair back. The sound of it on the hardwood floor was small and unhurried. She folded her napkin beside her plate, stood and walked out of the dining room without looking at her husband. Nobody called after her. I looked around the table at Derek, staring at the page with the ownership percentages, at Ryan still standing at Emily by the doorway, with her hands now still at her sides, at Victor sitting in the particular rigid stillness of a man whose evening has not gone the way he planned. I had not said a word since I read Derek's text message aloud. I had not needed to. I left Greenwich at 9:43. I did not say goodbye to Victor. I found Emily in the front hallway, touched her arm once, and told her to drive carefully. She nodded and pressed her lips together and looked like she wanted to say something that had not yet found its shape. I told her we would talk soon. Then I got in my car and drove south on I-95 toward the city. Claire's call came 18 minutes into the drive. "The lead investor just contacted me," she said. "Marcus Holt. He has a business relationship with one of Whitmore Horology's licensing partners in Switzerland. Someone at the dinner tonight apparently knew him, one of Victor's cousins, I think, and called him on the way home." A brief pause. "He heard everything, including what Victor said to you at the Mercer kitchen last Friday." I kept my eyes on the road. "What did he say?" "He said he is withdrawing from the project immediately." Claire's voice was careful and precise, the way it got when she was delivering information she wanted me to hear correctly the first time. His words were the offering documents described the Spring Street property as a family asset in transition. If the property owner never agreed to that description, then the offering documents contain a material misrepresentation. Every investor who relied on those documents to make a financial decision has potential exposure to securities fraud claims. I drove for several seconds without responding. "He's sending a withdrawal notice tonight," Claire continued. "And he told me he is forwarding his concerns to the other two investors in the group." I already knew what that meant. A development project of this size could not survive the withdrawal of its lead investor. Under these circumstances, not with the offering documents under scrutiny, not with a property owner who had never agreed to any of it, not with a paper trail that now included a forged signature, a breach of loan terms demand letter, a criminal trespass report, and an attempted fraud filing. No investor with legal counsel would stay in a deal that looked like this. The project was finished. Not because I had demanded it, Not because I had threatened anyone or called a press conference or done anything dramatic. It was finished because Victor had built it on a foundation that was not his to build on, and the weight of that had finally come down. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired in the particular way. You feel tired after something that has taken too much from you for too long, not the tiredness that sleep fixes, but the kind that settles somewhere deeper and takes its time leaving. I parked on Spring Street at 11:15 and sat in the car for a few minutes before going inside. The shop was dark. The lettering on the front window caught the streetlight the way it always did at this hour: Whitmore Clock and Watch Repair Est. 1989 white paint on glass, slightly worn at the edges of the W and the second H, which I had been meaning to touch up for 2 years. I went inside, turned on the work table lamp, and made a cup of coffee with the small machine on the shelf beside the reference books. Then I sat at the work table in the quiet and drank it. The pocket watch was still there under the lamp, Arthur's watch, the one the man had brought in on Friday morning a week ago today. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. For Arthur, time well spent. I had cleaned the movement on Tuesday evening, replaced the broken mainspring with one from stock, regulated the balance wheel. The watch was running now. Had been running since Wednesday morning, keeping time in the dark while I was in Greenwich watching Victor's evening fall apart. Some things just needed the right attention at the right moment. My phone buzzed on the work table. "Emily," I answered. "Dad." Her voice was different, not the fractured, careful voice from the past week. Quieter, more settled, like something had released in her that had been held too tight for too long. "I'm not calling to ask you anything. I just wanted to tell you something." "Go ahead," I said. "Shoo, I signed a lease this morning," she said. "Before the dinner tonight, an apartment in Williamsburg. It's small. It's mine." A short pause. "I used my own money. What was left in my personal account before Derek got involved with the rest of it." I looked at the pocket watch in my hand. "Good," I said. I know there's still a lot to figure out." Her voice stayed steady, which cost her something I could tell. "But I didn't want you to hear it from someone else." "I'm glad you called," I said. After we hung up, I sat for a while longer with the coffee and the watch and the quiet of the shop at midnight in July. Outside Spring Street was nearly empty, a cab moving slowly through the intersection, the distant sound of music from somewhere a few blocks south, the particular urban stillness that settles over Soho after the restaurants close. I thought about Margaret. About the way she used to sit in the chair by the front window on late nights when I was still at the work table reading with her feet tucked under her, not saying anything, just present. I used to think I was the one keeping the shop alive in those years. I understood now that it had been both of us all along, and that some part of her was still here in the wood of the table and the crack in the display case glass and the worn letters on the window. I locked up at 12:30 and walked to my car. I did not look back at the sign. I did not need to. She came on a Tuesday morning in early August, 3 weeks and 4 days after Greenwich. I knew it was her before I looked up the particular way she knocked 3 times slightly uneven, the same as when she was 12 years old and wanted to come into the workshop without startling me. I had not heard that knock in years. I had not realized until this moment that I had missed it. I crossed the shop and opened the door. Emily was standing on the front step in a plain white shirt and dark jeans. Her hair pulled back. No makeup, a small envelope held in both hands against her stomach. She looked like she had slept, which was an improvement. She looked like she had also done a great deal of thinking, which showed in a different way a quietness around her eyes that had not been there a month ago. "I didn't call first," she said. "I wasn't sure I'd actually come until I was already on the subway." "Come in," I said. She stepped inside and stopped near the front counter. A customer was at the back of the shop waiting for a wall clock I had finished that morning. I held up one finger to Emily, completed the transaction, and walked the customer to the door. When I turned back, Emily was still standing exactly where she had stopped, not touching anything, not looking around, just waiting. She held out the envelope. I opened it. Inside was a single folded page, the document she had signed 3 months ago, confirming that I had promised to leave the shop to her. The original, not a copy. She had taken it back from Derek's files when she packed her things. She took it from my hands, unfolded it, and tore it in half. Then in half again. She set the pieces on the glass counter without ceremony, the way you set down something you are finished with. "I'm not here for the shop," she said. "I'm here to ask if I can still be your daughter." Her chin was up and her voice was steady, and I could see exactly how much effort both of those things were costing her. I did not answer immediately. I went behind the counter and pulled out the stool on the customer side, the one that had been there for 30 years, the one Emily had sat on as a teenager doing homework while I worked. I set it in front of the counter. "Sit down," I said. She sat. I pulled my own stool around and sat across from her, the glass counter between us, and we talked. We talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I know because the wall clock behind me chimed twice during the conversation, and when Emily finally stood to leave, the light through the front window had moved from morning to midday. We did not talk about the money. We did not talk about Derek or Victor or what came next, legally, or how the divorce would go. We talked about the things that had been in the room at the Mercer kitchen and had never been named. Emily said the thing that cost her the most to say about 20 minutes in, when we had gotten past the apologies and into the territory underneath them. "When he threw the coffee at you," she said, "I heard it happen, and I looked at you, and I knew right then what I should do. I should have stood up. I should have said something." Her voice tightened, but did not break. And I just sat there. I kept thinking, if I make this worse, it will be worse, and so I did nothing, and it was already the worst thing I'd ever done. I looked at my daughter across the counter. "I know," I said. "I was looking right at you." She flinched, a small, honest movement. "I understand why you were afraid," I said. 8 years is a long time to learn that keeping quiet keeps the peace. That doesn't happen overnight. I paused. But understanding why doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to pretend." "What are you asking?" She thought about it. Really thought the way she used to think as a child when she wanted to get an answer exactly right. "I'm asking for the chance to be someone you can trust again," she said. "Not today, just eventually, if I earn it." I looked at her for a long moment. The torn pieces of the document were still on the counter between us. The morning light was coming through the front window, at the angle it came through in August, catching the dust in the air above the display cases, the way it always had. "Same time Thursday?" Emily asked when she stood to leave. I checked the wall clock. "I have a movement to finish by noon. Come at 1. She nodded. At the door, she turned back, and for a moment she looked very young. Not 12, but some version of herself that existed before 8 years of learning to make herself smaller had settled in. Then she squared her shoulders and walked out into the August morning. I stood at the front window and watched her go until she turned the corner and disappeared. Then I went back to the work table and picked up the movement I had been working on before she knocked. The launch event for Whitmore Horology's newest movement was held on a Thursday evening in October in the shop on the corner of Spring and Worcester. Claire had suggested the Midtown Hotel with the room that seated 80. I had said no. She had not argued, which meant she had expected that answer. By 7 o'clock, 43 people were standing between the display cases and the work table engineer's licensing partners. Two men who had worked with me in the early years and were now running their own firms. A writer from a trade publication who had asked 3 excellent questions and 1 very bad one. Someone had brought flowers which sat in a jar on the front counter and looked exactly right. Emily was standing at the back of the room near the door to the street, wearing a dark green jacket I had not seen before. She had come early to help Claire arrange chairs. When I arrived, she had been moving a table and had looked up and said simply, "Hi, Dad," in the voice of someone who has been practicing ordinary and is getting better at it. Claire introduced me at 7:15. I stood at the front of the room with my back to the window and looked out at the people gathered between the cases and the work table, and thought about the first night Margaret and I had stood in this space, with nothing in it but 2 folding chairs and a workbench we had borrowed from her father. I had written notes. I did not use them. "Y'all, I've spent my life working with watches," I said, "so I understand something about small things. A single gear, something you could lose between the floorboards, can determine whether an entire movement runs or stops. A small shop on a corner in Lower Manhattan can hold an entire life." I looked at Emily. I used to think that taking care of the people I loved meant solving every problem before they felt it. I was wrong about that. The best thing I ever did for this shop was refuse to give it away. The best thing I ever did for my daughter was the same thing. Emily's jaw tightened. She did not look away. After when the room had cleared and Claire was putting chairs back and the flowers were still in the jar on the counter, Emily came to stand beside me at the work table. "Do you think you'll ever leave this place to me?" she asked. "If you're asking because you want to own it." I said no. She nodded slowly. "And if I'm asking because I want to understand why you love it, be here at 8 tomorrow morning." She was there at 7:58. She came through the door in old jeans and a flannel shirt with coffee from the place 2 doors down, the same place Claire always used, which told me something about the past few months I had not known. She set the coffee on the counter and looked around the shop with an expression I recognized, not nostalgia, not ownership, but the particular attention of someone trying to learn a place from the beginning. I took Margaret's old apron from the hook beside the work table and held it out. Emily looked at it for a moment. Then she took it, looped it over her head, tied it in the back, and turned to face me. The bell above the door rang. The young man from 3 months ago came in, the one with the grandfather's pocket watch, the one I had taken in on a Friday morning in July when the world was still quiet, and I did not yet know what the week would bring. He was carrying a small box. "You called about the watch being ready," he said. "And my mother found something else in the same box. She thinks it was my grandmother's." He set the box on the counter and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in the same old flannel, was a second watch, smaller, a lady's pendant watch, silver case. The crystal slightly fogged with age. I picked it up and held it near my ear. A faint, unsteady tick. Weak, but present. "Can you fix it?" he asked. I looked at the movement through the crystal. Then I looked at Emily, who was leaning forward slightly over the counter, her eyes on the watch, her expression open and genuinely curious in a way I had not seen since she was a child, sitting in the chair by the window doing her homework while I worked. "Yes," I said, "but it'll take some time." The young man asked if I was sure. I set the watch down under the lamp, reached for my loop, and felt Emily move to stand beside me close enough that I could see her reflection in the glass of the display case. "The things worth keeping always do," I said. I spent 60 years thinking that loving someone meant solving every problem before they felt it. I was wrong. "Don't be like me," Don't wait until someone throws hot coffee at you to understand that saying nothing is still saying something, and that every time you stay quiet, you hand someone else the pen to write your story. I believe God places certain moments in our path, not to show us what we own, but to show us who we are when someone tries to take it. My honest opinion, kindness without a boundary is not generosity. It is an invitation, and some people will accept it without ever asking permission. These family stories, revenge, are not about winning. They are about the moment you finally stop paying the price for someone else's choices. If this family drama revenge reminded you of something you have lived through or someone you love is living through right now, share it. It might be the story they needed to hear today. Leave a comment and tell me what is the one thing you wish you had said sooner. Subscribe to the channel. More family stories revenge are coming, and every one of them matters. More family drama revenge stories are waiting for you here, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Some stories ahead contain fictional elements built for reflection and understanding. If this content is not for you, that is perfectly fine. Choose what serves you best.